So now that we've got a bit of a drum pattern worked out where we can use all of these, so I'll take this loop and we can consolidate that too. So now we've got all of these loops going on, and we can get rid of these other drums that we had earlier. And we can start to play around with editing this whole track and making our own little kind of remix of this. All right, then we can just take that, all that stuff that we have selected, and hit Command D to duplicate. All right, so we can start playing around with maybe muting some of these here and just adding in a little bit of layers. All right, and then now what we can do is start to use some of the editing that we did earlier. And we can also start to maybe add in a synth sound, right? So we have some drums in there. We can go ahead and add in a synth sound and maybe start to edit this track and make it sound like a bit more of a remixed kind of deal where it's not just us putting a drum pattern over the track. All right, so there's a couple things we can do to start making this more interesting and make it more of an actual bootleg remix. And one thing we can do is we can go into our audio effects and grab out this EQ8 and put it right on the track. And we can start to filter out some of the low end and possibly even make our own bass line. So the sub bass in this track is taking up a lot of low end. And what we can do is choose a high pass filter and filter out a lot of that low end and maybe put in our own bass. So now that leaves a lot of space in the low end for us, because without that, it sounds like this. So now we can use our own bass in there, and maybe we can even bring that bass back in at like a breakdown later on in the track or something. So now this is where we would want to add in a MIDI track. So we can press Command-Shift-T, or if you go into your file drop down and you go to Create, Insert MIDI track, you see that there's a shortcut there. I like using shortcuts because it'll help me to work a lot faster while I'm doing this. All right, and then what we want to do is we want to choose a bass instrument. Now, if you don't have a third-party plugin like some of these extra synths, what you can do is just use some of the stock sounds that are already there. So when I say third-party plugins, that what I'm talking about is something like Massive or Contact or anything like that. We've also got Spire. That's another option. So if you don't already have one of these third-party synths, you can always just grab a synth from Ableton, right? If you don't have Ableton Suite, then you might not have things like Operator or Electric or Collision and stuff like that. But you do have Simpler, and there'll be instruments in there, and you could always grab a bass from there. Let's try this Bass Lab. So now if you put a synth in here, the next thing you want to do is figure out what's the key of this song, because there are notes that are going to be in key with that song and notes that are going to be out of key with that song. And one of the hardest things to do if you're not really familiar with listening to different pitches and knowing if things are on pitch or off pitch, you might struggle with this with trying to make a remix and trying to make it so that you're playing the right notes that fit with that particular song. A lot of times I'll have a piano in there, because with a piano, you can really hear the notes that you're playing against the notes that the song is playing. So I might loop a section in the track and then just try to play the notes along with it to figure out what notes that are being played in this particular track. So I'll mute out all this other stuff that I don't need. I just want to focus on the track itself and the piano. So one trick for figuring out the key of the song is to find out what note you can play throughout the entire track that doesn't sound like it's off from the track. And that tends to be the key of the song. Another plugin that's kind of useful, especially in Ableton, is this tuner. And so if you put this on the track, sometimes you can see this will help you to kind of get closer to what the notes really are. For this particular track, it's going to be a lot easier because we have these sub bass hits one at a time, and there's not a lot of extra notes kind of being played at the same time. So the tuner might actually be able to pick this up. So let's play this and see what the tuner shows us. Bypass this EQ for now. We were gonna be stars. So C, F, G, and E. We were gonna be stars. We were gonna be on one. So if we only play those 4 notes, then we'll be able to play enough notes for this bootleg even if we just use those 4 notes for this. So we can put this back in with the EQ8. And then with our bass line, or even with our piano, we can play that C, C, F, G. We were gonna be stars. We were gonna be on. We were gonna be gods. We were gonna be someone. All right, so you can hear that we're playing kind of the right notes. So we play C, we play the F, we play the G, and we play the E. And now we can do that with the bass instead. We were gonna be stars. We were gonna be on. We were gonna be gods. We were gonna be someone. All right, so you can see how we can play the same notes as it, but because we're doing a remix, we can maybe start to change it up a little bit. So this is where we can get a little bit creative, but we can use those 4 notes and play around within the key of the song and make a different bass line. So we can add back in these drums, and this will give us that dancey feel, and then we can see what kind of bass line we want to make up for that particular track. And we don't have to necessarily play it in. There's another thing we can do is we can select this particular track here. We can select a region. If we hit Command-Shift-M, it'll create a new MIDI clip. And in that MIDI clip, now we can draw in notes, or we can play them if we have a MIDI, if you have a MIDI controller. All right, so I'll turn this up a little bit. All right, so we can just do a simple kind of rhythmic pattern there. And again, we can use this grid right here. We can set it to 16th notes. So if we double click on this grid here, it'll drop in a MIDI note. We can duplicate it and move that over with the arrow keys. So I'm just using duplicate Command D, and I'm using my arrow keys to move the notes over. So we want that to be an F. So if you look, we highlight that note, you can see over here on the piano roll here that it shows us an F. So remember, C, F, and G, and then also E. And now if those are the only notes that we want to be able to play, because I have notes drawn in on each one of these, I can hit this fold option and just put notes in any one of those. So I can kind of get rid of all of the extra notes that might be the wrong notes for this particular track. So now I'll just create a bass line for this track. So again, I'm just hitting Command D to duplicate, moving the notes around, and this is in 16th note patterns, right? So there's 16 notes for every bar. So if I duplicated this note out, this E note, I would go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So there's 16 notes I can play for every bar. And I'm just using different patterns inside of there to make up a rhythmic pattern with this bass line. So I can copy these notes here, can duplicate those and start them back at the 1. Oops, that E went away. So I'm going to unfold that so I can get that E back. And so now I have the C, E, F, and G. So those are the notes for this particular track. And now I'll just stretch that out. I'll just stretch this out here so it plays for this whole verse, or for this whole section, right? So I'm just setting my loop so that way this plays during all of that. And now if I unfold this, I can select all these by hitting Command A. So I can select all the notes that I have playing here. And if I hold Shift and the arrow key, it drops it down 1 octave. So I can try it in lower notes. All right, so it's the same exact notes, but we're playing it an octave lower, which means we've dropped them, all of these down 12 semitones, right? So we dropped it down from the C3 down to the C2. I think it sounded better up higher. So I'm just playing around some different rhythmic patterns here to see what sounds more interesting. All right, so now we have a bass line, and if we want that to stand out more, there's other things that we can do for that. Sometimes it's easier to just grab another instrument that has a different kind of sound and layer it on top of that. So we can take this and duplicate that track. And now, instead of this bass lab that we have, we can change this for a different sound. So we can find a different bass synth sound. Maybe something a little more aggressive. And so this is where we might want to play around with taking all of this stuff again down one octave. So I'll select all of these, Command A, hold Shift, down arrow, and now I'm playing this note lower. So I'll change the color just so we know that it's a different instrument too. And the cool thing is I can use this swap mode here and I can go try different sounds out. Let's see what that does. That one sounds kind of weird. And let's try taking those back up an octave. Command A, select all these, Shift, up arrow key. All right, cool. And then we could also use an EQ after this. Kind of take off a little bit of the buzziness on the top, on the high frequencies. So on this bruiser one, we're just adding an EQ. I'm going to turn on this this low pass filter. All right, so now we have a bass line that fits in here a little bit better, and it feels a little bit more dancey than just this, the bass line that's in the track itself. So now maybe we could try using this to open up the track to start things off with. So let's see how that sounds. We'll put that through the track a little bit. So I'm just duplicating out those notes that we just made and start it from the top. Would help if I put them on beat. All right, so again, I just duplicated those out. They're all starting from the downbeat. And here's a really fast way to kind of make that stand out a little bit better. You can use Ableton's multi-band dynamics, and a free compressor you can use is this OTT from X4 Records. It basically does the same exact thing. So X4 Records kind of copied Ableton's multi-band dynamics, but if you just grab the OTT, you can do the same thing. We were gonna be something. We were gonna be stars. All right, so that's just on one of the bass tracks, and I need to do it for the other one as well. So I can just copy this by holding Option and clicking on OTT and dragging over Bruiser. So now I'll have both of these being compressed. So now it's starting to sound like a bootleg because again, we don't have the stems for this song. We're just kind of making a remix using the song itself. Okay, so you may be wondering what the heck is this multiband dynamics and why am I putting it on here and what's the point of this stuff? If you're not familiar with compression, then this is just a multiband compressor, and what it's doing is it's turning down the volume in certain frequency ranges. And without getting into too much detail, these parts right here, these orange ones that I pulled down, these are called expanders. All right, so we want to turn those down on this particular setting, the OTT, and then I'm just using these ones, the blue ones to the right, to just kind of set the level at which it starts to compress. And so if you just use this preset and just set the threshold so that it's not over compressing the sound, then you'll get a decent sound. This is a really great technique for helping to make instruments kind of stick out and stand out and even level out the frequencies so that way they sit in the mix a little bit better. So now what we can do is we can also start to use some of those editing skills. So we can use the beginning here. We can probably leave that in the beginning, and then when he starts to sing here, we can start to chop up what he's saying. We were gonna be something. We were gonna be stars. All right, so now we can take this and we can make it quarter notes and just make them say stars a couple times. So we can just select this, hit Command D, and see what that sounds like when we drag that out. So we can do maybe the same thing here, and maybe we could do it with the bass line this time, right? So we'll switch these to 16th notes, and we'll just take this and duplicate it there. So where this bass note starts here and this bass note starts, we'll have this kind of repeating at the same time as that bass note. So let's change that a little bit so it actually sounds like it's on time. I'm going to go back to the narrow grid because I want to pull this back and try to get that lined up a little bit better. So I can break this here and maybe pull him back a little bit there too. So now he should be saying it on time. And then maybe drag this out and duplicate it. Copy this basically over here. So now it's going right with the bass line. All right, and we can maybe take this again, copy it, can Command C and then Command V, paste it there. And just make sure this one starts there. So it sounds kind of weird where it drops off there. So maybe we could switch the note. And this is where we can have some fun with taking this and using that transposition again, right? So maybe we could try transposing it down. And we'll transpose this one down a bit too. Gotta see what note sounds right for this. Let's solo this out with the bass. We were gonna be someone. We were gonna. Yeah, I think four semitones works. And then again, we'll just copy this one over to the other bass line there. We were gonna be someone. But we didn't know. We were gonna be stars. We were gonna be home. We'll take this one over to match the bass line too, and bring that back so it starts on the downbeat. Maybe we could start doubling this guy up again. So I can select that and hit Command D. And then from this guy, I can, let's see. I want to make sure it starts on that bass note, right? So we can pull that out. And then I'll hold Option and drag that over to that other bass note so they line up. So each one of these are going to line up with that. And we'll just pull that out a little bit more so that way we're not chopping it too short. Maybe with this one we can just do it every quarter note. So Command D, Command D, Command D. And maybe we could take this one and do half as long and double it. All right, so we don't have to have the verses in there if we don't want. There's a couple of things we can do. We could do like a breakdown right here where it kind of goes back to the no drums again, where it's just the bass and the vocals.
But we never belonged here. No, we never belonged.
All right, so we can do something like that where when we have a breakdown, this would be kind of the breakdown section, and then it builds back up again. And so this whole time while all of this is going on, all of these things are going to build up until it breaks down somewhere over here. So we can kind of add in another layer, maybe add in a synth here when he starts to shout a bit more. So we could probably keep the drums going through this and then duplicate those out. And so then it'll drop out somewhere over here.